Xenophilia, written by Anonymous. Leroy, after coming to Equestria, continued to make mistakes, but simply he didn't understand the pony's social norms. Can he figure out some of the differences before he inadvertently breaks some pony's heart? Once he understands the situation, will he be okay with the idea of a relationship with a pony? A romantic story that explores the differences between our societies and how that might affect the social interactions between our species. I am not the author of the story. The author has expressed his wishes to remain anonymous. However, this is submitted with his express permission in order to get this touching story out to a wider audience. Hopefully that you will enjoy this as much as I have. The Confession. The two figures laid sprawled on the equestrian grass, talking and laughing merrily. One was the human, and a relatively young man with an unlikely name of Leroy, short for Bellerophon, for his parents had been an odd folk, who'd ended up here with no mechanism or he or anyone else that had been able to disconcern, and who was yet unable to return home. He was slightly stocky with a fairly wide shoulders and a barrel chest, and had shoulder-length reddish blonde hair, and it was neatly trimmed with a red mustache and a goatee. The other figure was much smaller. The sky-blue coat and a rainbow-striped mane and tail of the Pegasus, adaptly named Rainbow Dash, stood against the deep green of the grass. She flopped down, half atop of the human where she had stopped to rest, and now lay her head and one foreleg across the chest, and one wing across his torso. The human idly stroked her mane with one hand while the two cheerfully revisited the pickup of the hoofball game they'd just finished in the village green. Rainbow had been Leroy's closest friend since he'd wound up in Equestria. Though identically suspicious, she had been quicker to accept the tall bim than her friends than they had, and she almost immediately appointed herself as the alien's guide to Ponyville. The two had gotten along like a house on fire from the very beginning. She'd let him around town, introducing him to every pony that came across, and they'd filled the time between in introductions and swapping stories from Earth and Equestria. The human had adapted to life in Ponyville much more quickly than he had expected. Once the Pegasus took him under her metaphorical wing, she started doing that literally after a few weeks, like now she was doing, and had made several good friends here, Rainbow first among them. The two spent a great deal of their free time together. Oh, Rainbow had plenty of days where she went off hanging out with Pinkie Pie or Applejack, and Leroy would be generally use that time to talk about comparative history with Twilight or chat with Fluttershy or Lyra, or even just go off on his own for a while. But those were generally exceptions. They taught one another games from their respective home cultures. Rainbow proved surprisingly adept to some of Leroy's word or board games once she had learned the rules. And the human had actually put a fair bit of extra muscle from the oftenly punishing physical sports the Pegasus had preferred. Rainbow was a consummate athlete, sleekly muscular with hardly of a trace of fat, and even his significantly greater size and recent muscle development, she was still stronger of the two by a substantial margin. Though the human's reach and more agile bipedal stance lent him to an advantage in certain sports, mostly the ones that disallowed flight. The Pegasus' wings largely neglected his physical advantages. Leroy had endurance advantage against most ponies too, Through Applejack, Rainbow Dash, even Big Macintosh could run him into the ground almost every time. The human and the Pegasus had been to be a proven absolute terror when they had been on the same team. Though regardless of what game they were playing, Rainbow still gloated occasionally over absolutely crushing defeat when they dealt with Twilight and Spike on a competitive board game than Twilight, well ever known would to be very good at. There they had an odd, awkward moment, of course, like discussions of the humanity nudity taboo, which the Pegasus didn't really understand. She was far from alone in that regard. He'd had so many questions about asking it. The ponies all thought that what it was really strange. He also still remembered how soft Dash's feathers had felt that time when he accidentally ran his hand across her wing. She twitched slightly and told him that was something generally not done in public. He'd taken the hint and refrained from stroking her wing there for all, though it was sometimes hard to remember when she had been draped across him like she did now. It had taken him some time to get used to the tactile of the ponies and the equestria tended to be. They tended to like to nuzzle, rub shoulders, embrace, and sit snuggled together in a way that had been identically discomforting to and slightly touch-shy human. But he adapted. Some of them seemed more prone to such contact than others. Dash, Twilight, Pinky, Lyra, and several younger Xenophilias had been doing that from the start, presumably because they hadn't been intimidated by the human size as some of the others. Most of the others in the town had followed in the suite in a week or so, or deciding if he was safe to be around after all. Rainbow was far and away from the most affectionate of the bunch, consistently sitting where she could lean up against him or lie half atop him like what she was doing right now. She even occasionally got to carry her around on her forelegs that was looped around his shoulders with her rear hooves hooked into his belt. Leroy had found this image of the horse-like being riding on the human's back to be humorously ironic, and Rainbow knew enough about his home world to appreciate the joke, too. She hadn't got quite used to appreciate the "in Soviet Russia" joke, unfortunately. No one in Ponyville ever commented on how much often she touched him, though, so either it was a normal way that the Sampian equinines to treat a close friend, or the blue Pegasus was considered too fearsome that no pony wanted to risk drawing her wrath by communicating on the habit. A possibility that wasn't too far-fetched, actually. She had a bit of a temper and was almost freakishly strong. All that was in the past, though, and he dwelled less on the past since winding up here in Equestria. The present was typically quiet and nice, so that was where his mind tended to stay, like now, for example. His muscle burned pleasantly from that light fatigue earned from the strenuous through enjoyable activity, a sensation that would be alien to a previous, quite sedentary human. A light sheen of sweat was quickly evaporating in the dry temperature air on weather patrol maintained over Ponyville, and his nose picked up a slightly spicy scent that suggests Rainbow had been sweating a bit too. He'd been surprised to learn that different pony subtypes actually had different scents when they exert themselves. Pegasi had the spicy scent he was picking up right now. The earth ponies had an odd sweet scent, and the unicorns didn't even seem to smell at all. He'd been quite self-conscious about it first, His body odor had never been particularly strong, but he thought that he stank to high haven compared to his new acquaintances, and he tended to go off on his own to cool down where he got sweaty. It wasn't until Applejack had commented that his smell was similar to the brand of cologne her brother used when he got all fancy, as the farm pony put it, that he realized that he actually smelled as pleasant to them as they did to him. Big Mac himself had later made a slightly envious observation to that effect too. Regardless, he was enjoying the feeling of lying on the grass, a cool breeze blowing by, and a good friend lying stretched out next to him. It was kinda funny actually. Holding the Pegasus was in a lot of ways of the opposite of holding a human woman. She didn't care at all if he touched her on the chest, but the back and upper shoulders was considered off limits. The area where the Pegasus' flight muscles extended both on the back and between her wings and around her upper shoulders evidently formed an erogenous zone, and Rainbow's were particularly sensitive. He'd drawn to a startled grasp of her the first time she'd snuggled up to him like this, when he'd idly trailed his fingers down her back in what he'd thought was perfectly an innocent gesture. He hadn't expected her to catch her breath and slightly extend her wings, and he'd seen her blush when he looked at her, with a slight frown. She'd given him an abbreviated description of the Pegasus mating practices as an explanation. Her blush deepened and her wings extended stiffly as she did so, and he realized that he had have take great care of certain gestures that would have been saved for another human, but would be considered quite erotic by Dash or other Pegasuses. Thankfully, they had been alone at the time, saving both of them a fair bit of embarrassment. He'd been very careful thereafter. Fortunately, there was plenty of ways Leroy could avoid some kind of awkwardness. He certainly had his arm half embraced his friend, and his elbow against her lower shoulder, and his fingers idly running down the cooler colors of her mane as it spilled through her neck. A gesture he found Dash enjoyed. Twilight liked it too, as did Fluttershy, Pinkie Pie, and Lyra. So he felt fairly safe in that assumption, that he wasn't doing anything he shouldn't. Fluttershy had actually commented that she suspected that gesture was to be reminiscent of the convergent similarity in social grooming practices from their respective ancestral species, which might have been why both species tended to find it soothing. The sentiment had been kind of a surprise. He hadn't realized Fluttershy was interested in evolutionary biology, though it had made sense that she would be. She was evidently more well-spoken and well-educated than most realized. He was reasonably sure Rainbow wouldn't tell him if he was doing something inappropriate, but the confirmation would have still been nice to have. They lay there for several minutes, enjoying the afternoon and one another's company, cheerfully bickering over who done more to secure their victory in the game. They'd both enjoyed a verbal fencing, as Rainbow had delightfully to discover. She could needle a human endlessly without him getting mad, and he had tended to give back better than he got. They didn't verbally squash her in a way Twilight tended to, though he'd never got offended, taking in every exchange in good humor, so she relished in the opportunity to sharpen her skills. Rainbow's voice trailed off, distracted, and Leroy looked at her quizzingly. She looked back at him for a few seconds, an odd look in her rose-colored eyes before landing in and kissing him. This wasn't a quick peck on the cheek or forehead. She'd done that before, quite a few times, as had several other ponies. This time, though, she'd kiss him full on the mouth, her lips soft, moving a bit as the kiss lingered. Neither of them used their tongues, and Dash didn't even try to force any serious intensity, but it was almost intimate. But it was the most intimate moment they shared by far. It lasted long seconds before Rainbow Dash pulled back, looking at her friend in the gauge of his reaction. Her normal brash attitude was in the ambience, and she hesitantly searched for a mirror for her own feelings in his face. Her heart sank like a stone when she saw the confusion in his eyes. "Oh no, did I misread him? But I was sure. I really thought he was interested. Oh, Celestia, I blew it. I totally blew it." Rainbow felt sick to her stomach. "I should have known better.